I've always had a great love for the environment and like to go out and hike in the woods and enjoy the beautiful outdoors. And in 1970, with the first Earth Day that was inspired and led by our great Senator Gaylord Nelson, I began to decide that we needed to do something more active about environmental issues. All across the country, people were beginning to understand that we needed to have a more political agenda, if you will. And so, with the help of my friend Peter Anderson, we put together a politically active environmental group in Wisconsin.
Our most immediate parentage came from the Civil Rights Movement. We just followed, I think, the path that they laid out.
And we called it Wisconsin Environmental Decade, and the idea was to work with the legislature and work with local groups all around the state that were having environmental problems and help them deal with the legislation going on at the state capitol. We operated out of my living room down in Kenosha, where I was living at the time. We had an old mimeograph machine that we used to produce the first Echo bulletins. Peter and I would put them together, and then we tried to get to Madison where we could be more influential with the legislature.
I was the only lobbyist who was so poor, the legislators would take me to lunch.
And we slowly but surely built up a pretty good membership around the state by contacting people and beginning to form the citizen pressure that would help pass the kind of legislation that we thought would be important for the state of Wisconsin.
One of the things that consumed our lives in the 70s was fights before the Public Service Commission, which made these enormously portentous decisions about whether to approve an enormous amount of new capacity and nuclear new capacity. And basically we thought, we gotta be there, we gotta be players. I cut my hair, I wore a tie, I played the part, and I learned to talk the talk, dollars and cents, not environment. In that period, the biggest fight we had and the most important fight we had was probably the power plant siting bill. It took so many years, it took so much of the political process that we ultimately triumphed. That was probably the most singular achievement at the time. She first showed up when she was in law school to ask for a job.
I knocked on the door and Peter Anderson opened the office door and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I want to volunteer."
There were so many people applying in those days because it was very much a chic thing in the early 1970s. So I said to her, "Don't call me, I'll call you."
He thought I would go away, and I didn't.
Thank God she persisted.
So his assignment to me was to trot off to the Department of Natural Resources and try to get them to stop doing urban sprawl things. That's all. We were taking on the establishment. So in every one of our lawsuits, there was big, huge law firms on one side and Peter and I on the other. And we were trying to get judges to say things that no judge in the country had ever said before.
After about the end of the first decade, we found a canvassing guru from Massachusetts. She ultimately had, in the summertime, about 100 canvassers, and she ran it with an iron hand.
When I was a graduate student here at the UW, I was looking for work. I saw an ad in the paper for environmental work. I applied, having no idea what the work really was, and then I realized when I got an interview that it was going door to door, knocking on doors to raise money for Wisconsin's Environmental Decade. And this is in 1982. We were working on acid rain legislation. We were working on comprehensive groundwater legislation. We were starting to work on recycling. The biggest issue through the 80s and 90s was the fight to stop the so-called Exxon mine or the Crandon mine. That was a huge issue in many regards. It was big because it was a local impact. It was the headwaters of the Wolf River. Then Governor Tommy Thompson swore that he would never sign that law to regulate sulfide mining in Wisconsin. There was such an outcry from the public that in the end, he signed that bill, which he swore he never would sign. The environmental movement in Wisconsin has changed a great deal since Wisconsin Environmental Decade was founded in 1970. The further out in time that you went, the more you sort of had to explain, well, our founders, Peter Anderson and Doug LaFollette, were absolutely correct that the 70s was going to be the environmental decade.
Really appreciate everybody joining us to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Earth Day.
What they probably didn't think as much about was that it would be around 3 or 4 decades later and what the name might mean then.
After decades of talking about our name and how Wisconsin's Environmental Decade perhaps did not explain well enough to people what our organization was all about, we made a decision to change the name.
The name Clean Wisconsin, I remember the meeting where that name came up. It was a former staff person who came up with it. And at this point, I think it has served us well.
The environment was a much more powerful force in the early 1970s, and the corporate influence was much less strong. So we had an easier go of it than you have it now.
Today, in some ways, things are more complex. The politics are more complex.
So today I'm working on mobilizing Clean Wisconsin members around rules for runoff from agriculture across the state.
I'm just staying updated right now on federal climate change.
Coal plants, we need to make a transition from dirty coal.
This organization is successful because we built a team of people that really are dedicated and committed to this cause. They love the special places in Wisconsin.
What we're trying to do right now is make sure that the governor's task force recommendations are passed into the strongest laws that we can get.
I'm heading to the Capitol right now to talk to state legislators about the importance of increasing our renewable electricity standard.
In some ways, it seems like the issues don't change much over the years. In other ways, they do. We really push the policymakers to do the right thing. We will enforce the laws as well as get them adopted, and we will take the polluters to court and hold them accountable.
Our side doesn't have more money than the other side, but what we have is we care more. We have passion, and that passion means that we don't go away.